Hey guys, back again with another video, a review on Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. And I played this through the Metroid Prime trilogy on the Wii U. You can also get it physically on the Wii, although it's getting very expensive. I think it's like over $100, probably more at this point. But I'd actually say it's worth it because this has actually now become one of my favorite trilogies in gaming, and the Metroid series has quickly become one of my favorite series. I really enjoy this series, and Metroid Prime 3 was one of the last ones I needed to play. Metroid Prime 2 I thought was a little disappointing coming from the first one. That game was very flawed. It was very frustrating in a lot of ways. You can check my previous review of that, but Metroid Prime is my favorite Metroid game. Like, I absolutely loved that game. And, you know, I'd heard that Metroid Prime 3 was better than the second one, but not as good as the first, from quite a few people. And, yeah, I agree with that sentiment. But yeah, let's get right into the review. I guess we'll start with story first, and this is one of the more interesting things with this game compared to the previous Prime games. This game's got more of a focus on story. There are actually a lot of cutscenes in this game, whereas Metroid Prime 1 and 2, a lot of the story came through like the lore that you'd find by like scanning things. Although Metroid Prime 2 had a few cutscenes, but this one there's a bunch of them. Right in the beginning of the game, you actually have a bunch of NPCs to talk to. This game has a bunch of guided objectives too. The Galactic Federation is always going to be talking to you through your comms. And yeah, there's a lot of dialogue in this game as well. And you'll actually just go around on this like ship in the beginning talking to people. And it threw me for a loop at first. It was very odd to me. Right off the bat, it felt different from previous Metroid games. You know, the series is always known for its sense of isolation and atmosphere. Usually Samus is, you know, alone on a planet and, you know, just exploring. And usually a lot of the people that went to that planet are found dead. But here, the structure is different as well, because you've got all these cutscenes and new characters that they introduce as well. This is actually a part of the game I like. But basically, the story of the game is like you encounter Dark Samus, and Dark Samus is like infected with like this phazon, what they call it, and it's like kind of spreading from planet to planet. And you have like these fellow bounty hunters that are with you in the beginning of the game, and they kind of disappear, and they've been infected too. And you're kind of like scouring like this small part of really it's like a galaxy map, and you're trying to find Dark Samus and stop the spread of this like corruption virus, like this phazon virus, which you've been corrupted as well, and that adds into like that ties into the game with like a gameplay mechanic called the hyper mode. We'll get to that in the gameplay, but the story basically has you trying to find these missing bounty hunters and stop the phazon from spreading throughout the galaxy. But yeah, a lot of cutscenes in this game, and a lot of like, you know, dialogue with like the NPCs. Even though of course Samus herself doesn't talk like with previous games. But the structure of this game is different from previous Metroid games as well. Metroid Prime 1 and 2, and in fact a lot of the 2D Metroid games as well, it's like one planet with all like these different areas that you're kind of backtracking to and from. But in this game, you've got this galaxy map where you're traveling to different planets with your ship. I think there's a few different planets, and then there's like some space stations that you'll go to. And this kind of reminded me of like Jet Force Gemini, because in that game you went to all these different planets, and then you could go back to previous planets with your new abilities and uncover new areas on those planets. And that's kind of how the structure of this game is. You know, you'll go to a planet, you'll do maybe half of it, you'll get a few new abilities, and then you'll go to the next planet, get a few new abilities there, and then later in the game you'll go back to that first planet with your new abilities, and you'll get some like new power-ups, and you'll kind of progress through the story. So this is very different. Some people are probably not going to like it. Now, like, the game still has a fairly decent atmosphere and like sense of isolation when you're on these planets, but some of them have like NPCs walking around, which really kind of makes the game lose its atmosphere. One level later in the game, it's like the last major area of the game. I'm not going to spoil what it is, but it was my least favorite area in the game because you were always getting like these radio talks from like your higher ups telling you what to do. And there was even a part later where all these NPCs came in, and you had to actually protect them. They had to like destroy this gate. So you're like going through like this action set piece moment in a Metroid game, protecting these NPCs and killing all these enemies, and it was really jarring. It was not a particularly fun sequence, and it really ruined like the atmosphere the game had kind of built up to that point with the previous planets, because on those you're at least isolated for the most part. But yeah, a different structure. It's not a structure I'd probably like to see visited again, but at the same time, I kind of enjoyed it as a one-off. It kind of makes the game have like this refreshing change of pace, I guess, from previous Metroid games. But I think at this, it might be a love it or hate it type thing. But yeah, I guess we should probably talk about the gameplay. I will say for the story, it's nothing special. Like the dialogue is pretty hokey in a lot of areas. The voice acting's not particularly good. But at the same time, I don't think it's ever too intrusive. For some reason, I found like the dialogue sequences in Metroid Fusion more intrusive than like the cutscenes in this. But at the same time, it also made the game not feel like Metroid in a lot of ways. But the gameplay itself is very similar to Prime 1 and Prime 2. But obviously, this game was made on the Wii, so the motion controls were the big thing with this game when it came out. And I've only played through the Metroid Prime games with these motion controls because they added them to the Metroid Prime 1 and 2 for the trilogy, and I think the controls really work well for the most part. I think they allow for more precise aiming, and you have the lock-on system as well. I'm sure it makes the original Metroid Prime games like 1 and 2 a lot easier, but for this one, the game was designed around these controls, and for the most part, I think they work well. They hurt your wrist after a while, and this is a problem I had with the previous Prime games as well. I couldn't play this game for extended periods. My wrist would just hurt after a while. And you have to actually... This was... I feel like it might have been in Metroid Prime 2, but to grapple, you have to, like, shake... Well, no, you could do a normal grapple, but in this one, you have to, like, grapple parts off of enemies. Like, you can attach your grapple to a shield on an enemy and, like, pull it off of them. But you have to, like, shake the Wiimote to do this, and I found it was actually kind of frustrating, especially in the beginning of the game. I kind of got used to it, but in the early game, I found it just wasn't working right, and I figured kind of a way to make it work better, and that's to try to be as far away from the target as possible, and then it works more reliably. But it was very frustrating in the beginning where you had this one part where you had to keep grappling these like levers in this open arena with respawning enemies, and the enemies would keep pulling the levers back down, so you had to do it really fast. And I didn't quite know like the tricks yet for like the nunchuck, but it was really frustrating. It just was not working right for me. But luckily, I did get used to it more as I played the game. But it's definitely not something I liked about the game. It was like the most annoying thing because the motion controls in the nunchuck are definitely not as good as the actual Wiimote. But the controls for actually aiming and like platforming and jumping. And scanning things are really great. I actually really like this control scheme. I would probably prefer it to the GameCube controller for the other two games if I went back to those. At least I'm pretty sure. But the game itself, the gameplay is fairly similar to the previous games. The combat is generally the same. You've got a decent amount of platforming, although not as much as previous games. You got some puzzle solving. The exploration is still top notch. You've got the same great map system. You've got you're still getting abilities, and you're getting progressively more powerful. The beam weapons in this game I actually really like. I think they're really cool. When you get like the fire beam weapon, it's like this nice power upgrade. You feel a lot stronger when you get that. Now, the exploration in this game is not as daunting or complex as in Prime 1 and 2. You're not going to get lost as often in this game, and your objectives are given to you a lot more often. In like the previous games, if you were lost and you were kind of running around for a while, after a long time, eventually they'd give you like a hint where it would be like press 1 and they'll give you like a guide marker. And in this game, they do that a lot more often, but there's a reason for that. Because the structure of the game is so different, at times you might be stuck at the planet you're on, and it turns out you'll have to go to another planet that you've already been to, and there's an area you can now get to. And sometimes it's easy to forget that you can do that. And the game will remind you at certain points, which I was actually kind of glad for, because there was one part where I was stuck on this planet, and it seemed like I could progress, but I just could not figure it out. And then eventually the game just told me, oh, hey, Samus, you might want to go to a previous planet that you've already been to before. And then I was like, oh, right, yeah, I forgot, because there's this one area on that planet that I forgot about that I can go back to now. So that's always kind of a satisfying thing when you can learn that on your own. But at the same time, I am kind of glad that the game kind of tells you that kind of thing more often than the previous games. If not for that, I actually might have gotten stuck a few times in this game. But overall, I don't think you're going to get lost as often as previous Metroid games. The environments overall aren't as big actually as Prime 1 and 2. My favorite environment in this game is Skytown. It's like this area, like this mechanical town, basically, above this one planet, and it's really cool. The music there is fantastic. There's a lot of cool puzzles, and the way that environment kind of wraps around itself, and how you kind of backtrack through it, but at the same time, it's not too annoying, the backtracking that you have to do on that planet. But I thought that was like a really well-designed level. And then the area you go to after that is like, it pales in comparison, and that's actually one of my complaints with this game. I feel like the first half is actually a lot stronger than the second. I feel like the exploration was just better in the first half, where the second half, the game gets very combat-oriented, and this is something with Metroid Prime 3 in general. It's easily the most action-heavy Metroid game I've played. There is a lot of combat in this game. There'll be areas where you have to do a combat arena to progress, and there's even one part where you have to defend like this structure, and then waves of enemies keep coming on like these ships, and you have to like you have to make sure like the enemies don't destroy this structure. There's that protect the NPC mission I was talking about earlier. There's a lot of areas where enemies will keep respawning, and you have to keep killing them, and sometimes you might have to do something, or sometimes you might have to keep killing them until you're able to progress. So a lot of moments like this, and by the second half of the game, honestly, it was getting a bit tiring for me. I primarily play the Metroid games for the exploration, and kind of like the puzzle solving and even some platforming. And it's still here in this game, and it's still satisfying and fun and rewarding, but the amount of combat in this game, I think, was just a little bit too much for me. But at the same time, some people are probably going to really like that. The bosses in Metroid Prime 3 are, for the most part, really good. I think this game has the most consistent bosses in the series, because every single Metroid game, there's at least one boss that I fucking hate. Metroid Prime 2 had some of my favorite bosses in the series, and some of the worst. Metroid Prime, there was a few bosses I was not a fan of. This game, I didn't dislike a single one of them. I pretty much liked all of them. Now, I don't think any of them were amazing. A few of them were quite good, but nothing was, like, mind-blowing. But at the same time, I enjoyed all of them, that's a big plus for me. That's a big plus compared to previous games in the series. But, I'm trying to think what else. The difficulty is actually it's lower than previous games. I only died a few times, and a lot of my deaths were kind of bullshit. Like I said, the environments aren't as complex as before, and it's just, I don't know, I feel like the energy tanks, like the health tanks, you get a lot more of them early on than the previous Metroid games, so you're probably not going to die as much. And then there's Hyper Mode, and this is like the main mechanic with this game. Metroid Prime 2, it was the Dark World, and this one it's the Hyper Mode, where, like I said before, you're kind of infected by Phazon, and if you hold plus, you'll go into like this Hyper Mode, where your attacks will get more powerful. You can destroy a lot of enemies more quickly. You can destroy armor on enemies much quicker, and then you can solve different puzzles by doing this as well. And you can't actually get damaged in this mode, but it does use up an energy tank. So there's kind of like a risk-reward system in place for using this. And if you use it too much, you'll actually get corrupted, and you'll basically have to keep firing to kind of get out of the hyper mode for a bit. And if you kind of stay in hyper mode too long, you're actually going to die. And this is kind of interesting. Now, I've heard complaints that the hyper mode is overpowered and makes the game almost broken, but I feel like the game is designed around this, that you're supposed to use it, because a lot of the enemies in this game are complete damage sponges, especially compared to Prime 1 and 2. A lot of them have like thick armor that it takes forever to get through them, even with missiles. And your beam weapons aren't particularly effective. So a lot of times when I ran into like these enemies, I would immediately go into hyper mode because I felt like it was completely necessary, or it would have been like this tedious, drawn-out battle. And you know, maybe I would have it so that you would be able to get damaged in hyper mode. I think that's probably the big factor here, which makes it maybe a tiny bit broken. And some of the bosses, if you use it at the right time, it will just completely shred them in seconds. But a lot of times too, like I found when I was fighting bosses, I was using hyper mode a lot, but I was tending to miss because you have to be pretty accurate with your shots. And then I would waste all these energy tanks, and then eventually I would get low on health. So I think the risk-reward system kind of worked for me. You know, again, without the hyper mode, the game just would be fucking tedious. I really think you're meant to use it for a lot of like these enemies and situations, and it gives you like this great sense of power too when you use it. You feel like a complete badass when you're using this mode. So I actually enjoyed it as a mechanic overall, and there's a neat twist that they pull later in the game, like way late in the game, that I don't want to spoil, that I thought was really cool as well. And I also thought it was really cool how the bounty hunters you meet in the beginning that are kind of good guys, later get corrupted, and you find them later. They're enhanced with Phazon, and you kind of have boss fights against them, which I enjoyed every single one of those. I thought that was really cool as well. But yeah, I actually enjoyed this mechanic overall, and I didn't think it was too broken. And some enemies will actually like this. This was weird. Like one time I was walking, and I got hit from something from behind, and I went to hyper mode, and I died almost immediately. Because some enemies can actually trigger this hyper mode on you, and I read online, and apparently it was because I wasn't firing fast enough. And if these enemies actually infect you with the Phazon and you're not quick enough, you will just flat out get a game over, like almost immediately, which I thought was kind of interesting. You know, there's still save points that you'll find in this game, and the save system is actually different in this game. And this is something that some people are going to hate. I actually appreciated it, where this game will often auto-save before like areas where you're like fighting a bunch of like waves of enemies or bosses. So if you die on a boss, you'll start right at that boss. And I liked this because the save points are fairly spread out in this game, and a lot of the times you would have had to do like these long exploration sequences all over again if you died at a boss. And the fact that they put like these save points right before a boss, I really appreciated that. Now, some people are going to think that's just too far, that's just pushing things a little too far. It makes the game way too easy. I honestly, I liked it. And, you know, yeah, the game's easier than previous Metroid games, but I still thought it was like a nice change of pace. And I don't think it was too easy. I honestly don't think it was like crazy easy or anything. And previously I just played Okami HD. Like, that game was far easier than this. But yeah, what else to say? I guess one other thing, and this actually applies to like the Metroid Prime games in general, but man, are missiles completely useless. Like every time you get a missile expansion, like that's like the main collectible in these games, and I feel like missiles are just not as useful compared to like the 2D Metroid games. They take a long time to fire. It takes a long time to charge up your like homing shot to shoot multiple missiles at once. It's far easier to just use your beam weapons, and especially hyper mode in this game. I barely used the missiles, and that kind of made the exploration a little less rewarding when it's like mostly just missile pickups. I guess another gameplay thing too, you have your ship. So you can fly to other planets, and then there's like different landing sites on these different planets that you'll find. And you can kind of call your ship at these areas, and you can also kind of call your ship to do like missile bomb runs to attack certain enemies. Later in the game, you'll get a grapple beam on your ship. You can carry objects with your ship and like kind of transfer them to different points. It's not a huge part of the game, and I honestly kind of wish they did a little more with it. But nonetheless, it's something new in the game. One other thing too that I liked, near like the middle of the game, you'll find this area where you can kind of like send out these satellites that will actually show you where pickups are throughout the game. There'll be like these little white dots. and then there'll be like little X's if you've actually got them. And that's something I also really appreciated. I kind of wish Metroid Prime 1 and 2 had this. And I do like how it's not unlocked right off the bat. You actually have to work for it. And there's one part of the game where you have to backtrack a decent amount of ways to go back and activate these satellites. I thought it made it a lot less tedious to find a lot of like these pickups. And in fact, at one point I was really considering going for 100% completion rate. But eventually, it just started to get annoying with some of like the bomb jumps you had to do in like the morph ball mode, and that's another thing. I like how this game toned down the morph ball stuff compared to Metroid Prime 2. That was a big thing for me. But yeah, I just kept getting all these missile expansions, and eventually I was just like, okay, what am I doing? This isn't worth my time. So eventually, at like around 83% completion, I was just like, okay, enough of this. I'm just gonna go and complete the game now. But yeah, there's like a secret ending that I unlocked by getting 75% item completion. So you can do that as well. I would definitely highly recommend doing that. I'm pretty sure I know what the secret ending is after seeing the ending. But yeah, it took me a little over, like almost 13 hours to clear this game, which is about as long as the original Metroid Prime. So yeah, a good length. I didn't feel like it overstayed its welcome like Metroid Prime 2 did. So that's another good thing with the game. So yeah, safe to say I'm quite positive on this game. I guess another thing I haven't talked about the visuals. You know what? Honestly, I didn't think it was that much better looking than Metroid Prime 1 and 2. And you know what? I think this is because this is like I played the Wii versions of those games, and I think they look a little better than like the GameCube versions. And I'm pretty sure that's why like this didn't immediately jump out at me as like a much better looking game than Metroid Prime 1 and 2. The environments, like a lot of the planets are really nice to look at. One thing I was disappointed in, like the variety of environments, there are a lot of like spaceships and a lot of like mechanical areas in this game, and it starts to all look the same after a while. The last area of the game, like I mentioned earlier, was like the Protect the NPC mission. That area, everything looked the same, and it was just very visually uninteresting. So that was another factor as to why that area was a letdown for me, and why the second half of the game I felt was a little weaker in comparison. But this game still looks great. It's still definitely a great looking game. The audio in this game, the voice acting, like I said before, is kind of it's not great, but there's not too much of it. The soundtrack is quite good. Like with most Metroid games, the soundtrack's quite good. My favorite song is the two songs I really like are the song that plays in the Sky Town, which really adds the atmosphere and how amazing that place is, and then the music that plays in the ice part of the Brio planet, which is like this small area of the game, and it's the only time you hear this song, which sucks because it's really good. Man, snow levels always have like the best music I find in games, and it's pretty much the case with this game as well. I do think the soundtrack in this game is disappointing compared to Prime 1 and 2. I went back and listened to the soundtracks of Prime 1 and 2, and I was shocked how much I enjoyed Prime 2's soundtrack. I don't remember what I said about it in my review of the game. I know there were certain songs that I really liked, but I went back and listened to it, and man, I like the soundtrack in that game is awesome. Like, I really like it. Like, the Torvis Bog theme is so good. Like, that's like might be my favorite song in the entire series. So yeah, listening to those soundtracks again and then listening to Prime 3, I think it's a step down. They're just not as memorable. They don't have as interesting melodies. But there are some like really moody kind of atmospheric tracks in this game that I kind of liked. But overall, the soundtrack is still good though. I still really like that. And the Skytown theme and the ice theme in particular are quite good. But yeah, like I said before, safe to say I enjoyed this game. I thought it was a great game. I think it's worth playing. There's some things I didn't like about it. I'm not sure I loved the more action-oriented approach that this game has. There were certain moments in the game where it didn't feel like a Metroid game. It felt like it was trying to be like Call of Duty or Halo or something like that. Like the Protect the NPC missions. Like there's the constant NPCs you're talking to, and like the more like set piece moments that you'll find throughout the game. But overall, it does have a lot of strengths, and I think it's an improvement over Prime 2. but it definitely, I don't think it compares to the first one. I still think the first one is one of the honestly, to me, it's like the peak of Metroid in general. Although I've heard Zero Mission is really good, and I got to get to that game. That's like, I think that's going to be the game I play next in the series. But yeah, it's, I've finally gotten through the Prime trilogy, and man, what an experience! I think like, seriously, buy the Metroid Prime trilogy on the Wii U. You can get it digitally for like quite cheap. It's also honestly worth it if you want it physically. If you have to get it physically, like for $100, I still think it's worth it because these 3 games are all worth playing. Even 2, Metroid Prime 2, I shit on it a lot in my review. It's very flawed, but I still liked it overall. It's just kind of like the black sheep, I think, of this trilogy. But what a really good value in gaming, and one of my favorite packages, like video game packages for sure. But Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, worth playing if you can find it on the Wii, and the trilogy in general is highly worth playing. And I'm so glad I've finally gotten into like the Metroid series. Metroid Prime, I talked about it in the games I don't like that everyone else loves. It's always been one of those games that I couldn't get into, and I'm glad now it's like one of my favorite games ever, and the Metroid series is one of my favorite series ever. But yeah, that's it, guys. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.